Just going through these things in no particular order. On May 2nd, I will be participating in a telephone call with myself and a man named Dr. Iyad al-Siraj from Gaza, who's a psychiatrist well known in the Israeli-Palestinian peace circles. And this is a new technology they're trying out. The phone call is going to have 500 listeners, and you can be among them. So this is a week from tomorrow, 9 o'clock our time, and at 9 a.m. our time, I believe. Yeah, it'll be some horrible hour over there. And I'm going to try and get the phone number for people to call in. I'll try and have that on Thursday. If not, I'll CourseWeb it out to everybody. And I've just officially made CourseWeb into a verb. I have CourseWeb you. 7 p.m. over there. Not too bad. That's not too bad. Thanks, Nikki. It's good to have someone from the Middle East on hand for these occasions. So that's those two things. Tonight, here in Berkeley at the Berkeley Buddhist Monastery on McKinley and Bancroft, there is a talk from, so now this is somewhat, no, not somewhat, this is actually relevant to the topic that we have embarked on now, which is nonviolent culture. There's an element in that topic which is storytelling. It's well known that people get their ethical guidelines from stories more than from anything else. There's a book called Why Johnny Can't Tell Right from Wrong by a man named Bill McClintock, I think, and he proves that young people in particular, but not so young people also, really get their moral compass from narratives. That's why they used mythology in the old days, and today we use television. So storytelling and deliberately injecting a new ethical position into the world has become one of the techniques used in nonviolent culture creation. And somebody who does this for a living, I suppose he can make a living at this, at 7:30 tonight in the Berkeley Buddhist Monastery, he's going to be there. Okay. Moving on from there, yeah, hello.
What is that?
It's McKinley and Bancroft. So you want to go straight down Bancroft, but Berkeley High School gets in the way. You have to go around. Unless you want to climb over the chain link fence, which I have done a number of times. So now Paul Chappell, who spoke to us last week, who was in the Army, he, as I suspected he would do, he watched the webcast of our discussion of him. So he's probably watching now my comment on his webcast, and so on it goes. He has sent me 2 very long emails. He's keenly interested in getting involved in a longer dialogue with us. And I haven't really quite thought of how that would work, but he's an extremely interesting guy. He told me the only reason that he has not become a conscientious objector now is that it would not have any meaning because he's finished his tour of duty. So he would just be stopping, he would not be quitting. But he had so much to say that I wasn't able to respond to, and I do think it would be a wonderful idea if we stay in touch with him somehow. If you can think of a way to do that, set up a special blog space or something, we should continue talking with him. Years and years ago, Kenneth Boulding said, if we don't reach out and figure out a way of contacting the military, we're losing our best asset in peace creation. I mentioned when he was here that desertions have tripled in the last 5 years, and he pointed out that more West Point graduates have left the military, are leaving the military now than at any time in the last 30 years. So there's a real dissatisfaction there, partly for the right reasons, partly not, and we should be talking to those people. Next, let's see. I spoke at Tomales High School last week. They were a very, very nice audience of young people. They got completely, if I could use an old 1960s expression, they got turned on, and they now want to turn around and teach nonviolence in the local elementary school, and maybe move out from there and teach it to the cows. So I rashly suggested to my friend who's a teacher there that some of you would be interested in meeting and talking with these young people. So I just want to say that that's, until we get over the open house, I can't really plan anything, but I can still throw out ideas. So think that over. Tomales, California, lovely place. It's about an hour and a half drive from here, about 10 minutes drive from there to the beach. I want to take some high schoolers out to the beach for a picnic. Try to avoid that elephant seal that's been going around killing people, but seriously, or at least more seriously, I think this is a wonderful opportunity to create sort of vertical dialogue. They're keenly interested in football, so any of you have NFL backgrounds, be prepared to use that. Good news is that Michael Lerner will be coming to talk to us next week when we shift even a step upward into spiritual nonviolence, and we start today. And finally, two other things. Those of you who've been handing in your papers early, this is wonderful, and we completely encourage this, but I'm a little bit tied up right now, so give me a couple of days to get around to Maria. I think you get them back out to you. And the other thing is I hope you did have a chance to listen to the interview with Jack Duvall. I gave you the link last time. It was on yourcallradio.org/archive plus a whole string of numbers. You have it down somewhere, and I can CourseWeb it to you if you need. It was a very good interview, and I'm happy to say that Jack Duvall, who is the director of ICNC, International Center for Nonviolent Conflict, they did the film that we saw on Utpor, Bringing Down a Dictator. Before that, they did the PBS series called The Force More Powerful. He will be coming out to speak to the Teachers Conference in July. So if you get a chance, do listen to that interview. I think it's like a good kind of barometer of where different people are at now with the development of nonviolence. Okay, I want to get off the stage as quickly as possible so we can hear from my friend Nikki, who represents in the East Bay one of the most successful, and from many different angles, one of the most successful nonviolent organizations in the world, nonviolent communication. And would you tell us a little bit when you get up here, Nikki, about how big it is and how many people are reaching? Okay, but let me say a little bit more about an organization, because we started to talk about that, and we'll only be one lecture behind if we can say a little bit more about it here before Mickey comes on. I had said a few words, I think, about the consensus process that was developed by the early Quakers and how it was a much more articulate process than just we're all going to sit around and talk about it till everybody's happy and those who aren't are willing to keep their mouth shut. It's much more articulate than that. It does provide a systematic way for the community to make decisions and move forward without dividing itself into winners and losers. Sometimes even people who get up and say, I am a uniter, not a divider, turn out to be dividers. And you knew that all along, if you had more than about a 54 IQ that you were actually willing to use. But anyway, pardon my bitterness, but the standard political process is very divisive. It keeps on breaking down community. We call it democracy, but it's an alienating and segregating process. And there are worse things about democracy that Gandhi had to say that we pointed out last semester in the readings from Hind Swaraj. So if it's a particular interest of yours, get a hold of that little booklet called Hind Swaraj, or Indian Home Rule, and in it he critiques democracy as a system, not as an ideal. As an ideal, we're all totally on board with it, but as an implementation, especially by the British parliamentary system, he had some critiques. And he had to have, because they were using democracy as a club to beat India down with. We have democracy, you don't. if you're thinking to yourself, that sounds familiar. We're going to come in and carpet bomb you into democracy. That's still going on. So it's good to know that democracy as a political structure has certain shortcomings with regard to the implementation of loving community. And I talked about one of them when Paul was here, right? That has Kant and other people have pointed out that when democracies go to war, it's worse because it's like the whole community is taking responsibility, which means nobody is. Okay, so that much we had said so far, I think, about the Quakers, and I wanted to mention a new idea that's come into this whole concept, and that is the idea of looking even deeper into nature than the Quaker community, and looking at the way what they call living systems self-organize, and ask if there isn't an analogy which human systems can build upon to organize in a natural way that would enable us to maintain living community and still make decisions, and so forth. And in the 70s, there was this attempt to reorganize the world. Mostly it was being done in New York, which needed some reorganization at that point. And it was okay, but it was all on paper. And there was a project, for example, called the World Order Modeling Project. It has a very nice acronym, WOMP. And they were having tons of blackboards. They didn't have computers in those days, so there'd be all these blackboards and white newsprint paper, and they kept reorganizing the world. And no matter how they did it, there were two things wrong with it. It just kept on being hierarchical, for one thing, and second of all, it just stayed there on those pieces of paper in New York. It had no relationship to reality. Well, people are still trying that. Here's a very pretty picture. I don't know if you can zoom in on this. I think peace should be pretty. And this is an organizational diagram of the world, only not a standard hierarchical diagram where you have the $300 million a year CEO at the top, and all these little boxes going down and down. But just in terms of real interactions, who's talking to whom and who's doing what. And then a step beyond this, I think, is what we've come up with now with this Gaia hypothesis that the whole world is a living entity, and related to that, the idea that living systems have a marvelous capacity to organize themselves. And somehow we ought to be learning from that, if not imitating that. Well, in the world of nonviolent organization, the form that's been cooked up and used recently, as most of you know better than I, because you've probably actually been in one, and I just talk about this stuff, but it's this wonderful concept of the affinity group. And it turns out that if you rely upon that infallible source of wisdom known as Wikipedia, you will discover that the term affinity group actually goes back to the late 19th century Spanish anarchists. They did not fare very well in the Falangist takeover of Spain in 1940, but they were very passionate about anarchism. Anarchism, as you know, is something that we here in the nonviolent world feel sort of okay about. In other words, there really are two different kinds of anarchism. They all have in common that they don't want a central hierarchical authority, and as far as that goes, I feel that we're mostly on the same page with them. I'm going to continue that sentence in just a minute, but I'm interrupting myself. On May 10th, 1886, a court clerk made a mistake, and he wrote down in the records, again, there were no recorders of a mechanical kind in those days, so this was human error. He wrote down a ruling that, quote, corporations are persons within the intent of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, equal protection of the laws. So just one guy out to lunch, I don't know, had a fight with his wife that morning, something, wasn't thinking, made a mistake, and we've been condemned to this whole regime where corporations can come in and say it's my right to exploit you, and you utilize your water for my profit and all this. Now, this is a slight exaggeration. Clearly, if we weren't so out to lunch, we would not have seized on this ruling and made it into the practice of law. But it is interesting to note that there is really no 100% kosher legal basis for this concept that corporations are persons, which is the opposite of the organizational patterns that we're trying to develop now. So you had these grupos de afinidad, which I think is reasonable Spanish for affinity groups, and they had a very great strategic advantage, which was that there was no, two advantages really on the strategic level. You could not arrest the leadership because the leadership was diffuse, and even with Gandhi we saw that last semester. And the other great advantage was it was impossible for security services to infiltrate them, because the affinity groups were consisted of people whom everybody knew and trusted. This is a serious question. I remember when I left New York, a week after I left, somebody who had infiltrated the hippie / beatnik / whatever we called ourselves movement in Greenwich Village, it turned out to be a narc, and arranged for a raid. And a week after I left town, most of my friends were behind bars. It was the grace of God that got me out of there before they sprung the trap. But depending on what you're doing and how much secrecy it depends on, and how vicious the regime is that you're creating an opposition to, it can be very dangerous to have your identity betrayed. So affinity groups were very hard to penetrate. Even the FBI could not get in there. All kinds of funny stories, but I'm going to pass them over right now so that we can get finished. So affinity groups are more or less spontaneously formed. They're democratic. They come out of what would be called in German Gemeinschaft and nicht Gesellschaft, that is the organic community of the people and not the formally documented social structures. And they're not centralized, and they come into existence in context of action. And sometimes, which is very important, we've touched on this in so many different ways, they continue after the action. Partly because they like each other, if they do, and partly because they know that we are in this for the long haul, and if you have to reinvent your organization every time there's an issue, or at least every time there's an attempt to respond to an issue, you'll be very inefficient. You have to start this all over again. Well, I guess, let's see. Now, one more thing about what affinity groups do, and I guess Seattle was a classic example of this. There was something like 50,000 people who had showed up for that action. It was very, very successful. It led to what we now call the Miami model, so we can't do that anymore in quite the same way. But affinity groups are not just free-floating clusters. Affinity groups have a structure within themselves. They have different responsibilities. There's one person who's called a spoke, and that is a pun. It's a spoke as in a spoke of the wheel, and a spoke as in spokesperson. So this is the person who's going to talk to other affinity groups. It's about as funny as I'm going to get this morning, so I hope you appreciated that. And if there's enough, they'll also have a media person. They'll have a facilitator, so they can have meetings that are efficient without brutalizing everybody. That's very important. Now, this is new that other organizations don't have this in an informal way. They have a vibe watcher. So when people start to have these little machines, when people get too uptight, you can say, oh, if you're over 50,000, we've got to crank this back down. And they'll suggest that everybody stretch. Or there was one meeting in Seattle, a very big meeting, not an affinity group meeting. Somebody got up and was ranting and raving. Probably he was the other kind of anarchist. I didn't quite finish that sentence, but there are anarchists who are okay with violence and there are anarchists who are not. So he probably was part of the okay group. He got up and he started ranting and raving, and somebody just stood around and looked at the group and said, "Om." There's just quite a large number of people all going "Om" together, and just this guy was all chilled out and was fine, and they could continue the meeting. Then you read these very funny emails that were flying around saying they all stood up and made this noise. I don't know where it came from, but for some reason the meeting calmed down. Okay, so there is a vibe watcher, and there's also, now this is going to be a little bit tricky, there's a quick decision maker. Not to be confused with the person who prance and preens and says, I'm the decider, and you don't count. That's a different kind of person altogether. But if you're coming to a quick decision, are we going to lock ourselves down or are we not? You've got like 20 minutes to get out there in the street, and nobody, there isn't a consensus. You'll turn to this person who's reasonably trusted. He's taken the sense of the group, and he'll make that decision. Or he or she. So within the affinity group, this is a structure that's grown up, and I don't know whether they found documents from the anarchist movement in Spain and copied this, or whether it just grew up in practice because this is what you need. But that is what a typical affinity group looks like. And then the affinity groups will relate to, they will report to a cluster, and the cluster will report to a spokes council, which will be in charge of the entire campaign. So that's roughly how those things work. The internal organization of the groups and the way that they feed their decisions to other groups. So we will see whether this form can be perpetuated and adopted beyond the movements that they come up in and actually provide some sort of new basis for organizing society itself and possibly even the world. Okay, so at least we've said something about new organizations, and we can come back to it later, but I'm very eager now to turn the floor over to my friend Mickey, who's going to talk to us about nonviolent communication. Please welcome her. Okay, Mickey, can you get this? I got a little clip off here. Some neighborhood might get it. Here we are. Just underneath that thing, I think it goes in here. Okay. Okay.
This is going to be a bit of a challenge because I tend to be very interactive and not lecturing at all. I don't like to lecture, so I don't know how we're going to work the web, but I understand that the way to do it is that I will repeat what you say, which will be a great opportunity to model one of the skills of what I'm teaching. So I want to start by inviting you to reflect for a moment on what nonviolence means to you. What is nonviolence for you? Where does it sit in your heart? What are the values or principles that lie at the heart of it that are meaningful to you? So let's take a moment to reflect and then see if anybody wants to venture forward and say what it is for you. I depend on you. Anybody wants to respond? What makes an action or movement or speech nonviolent? Yeah.
I see something as nonviolent if it embraces life rather than pushes it away. That's kind of what I use.
Okay, so a metaphor of embracing what is instead of resisting and fighting it. Yeah? Yeah.
Mutual empathy.
So nonviolence involves mutual empathy. Now I'm going to ask you sometimes provocative questions. What do you do when the person at the other end is not ready to respond empathically? It's very, I've said many times, it's extremely easy to be nonviolent when everybody does exactly what you want. The problem begins when people act in ways that you don't like, one of which can be that they're not empathic back to you. So do you have a response to that?
I would, if I get too much triggered, I'd probably be with myself for a little bit until I can come back and give that person empathy until they hopefully calm down and feel seen and have their needs met, and then start from there again.
Okay, so what, say your name?
Matthias.
Matthias? So what Matthias is proposing is a model. Now, have you studied nonviolent communication before? You have. Okay, it was just too close. So what Matthias is proposing is a model in which I try to establish a relationship of mutual empathic care with another person. And then if they are not responsive, instead of dumping on them, instead of making them the enemy, the bad guy, the person to get rid of, I look to myself or to others to seek support, renew my fuel, so that I can come back to this person with an empathic presence that will allow us ultimately to make the connection. Yeah, I like that model. What else? What makes it nonviolent for you? Yes.
Well, I like to, okay, what makes it nonviolent for me would be to take actions without harming or without judging in other people in a way that would be creating friendships or relationships. And what I do when the person is not responsive, it really depends on the situation. If it's something mild or if it's something very outrageous, I might still try to communicate with the person. If it's something I see that the person might not be aware of nonviolent communication about nonviolence, but if the person is really mad, upset, or wants a reason to be even more upset, I'll leave the person alone, I'll do my own thing, and